1917, in the towns of Orange, New Jersey, the United States Radium Corporation hired hundreds of young women for the best-paying job in town. Their job was simple: paint the numbers on watch dials with a special luminous paint made from radium, so soldiers in the dark could read the time. The supervisors told them the paint was safe. Perfectly safe. Some of the women painted their nails with it, their teeth. They glowed at parties and thought it was magic. The technique they were taught was called lip dip paint. By the early 1920s, the women started getting sick. Their teeth fell out, their jaws collapsed, their bones fractured without reason. Doctors couldn't explain it. The company could. They had known for years. Internal medical reports confirmed the radium was destroying the women from the inside. Those reports were buried. In 1927, 5 of the sickest women, told by doctors they had months to live, decided to sue. The press called them the Society of the Living Dead. The company stalled. They hoped the women would die before the case was heard. They didn't. In 1928, so ill they could barely raise their arms to take the oath, the women appeared in court. They won. The settlement was modest, but the case changed everything. It established for the first time that corporations could be held liable for knowingly endangering workers. It became the foundation of modern occupational health law. Most of the radium girls died within years of the settlement. Their bodies were so saturated with radium that decades later, when researchers opened their graves, the bones still glowed green in the dark. On the morning of March 25, 1911, a 19-year-old named Rosie Friedman got dressed for work. She ironed her blouse. She kissed her mother goodbye. She told her she'd be home by 5. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building in Greenwich Village, New York. Over 500 workers showed up every day, mostly young immigrant women, Italian, Jewish, some as young as 14. Earning $6 a week if they were lucky. The owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were known in the garment trade as the Shirtwaist Kings. They'd built their empire on cheap labor and tight margins, and they ran a tight ship. Workers couldn't take unauthorized breaks. They couldn't step outside for air. They couldn't pocket even a scrap of leftover fabric. So every morning, the stairwell exits were locked from the outside. Workers filed in and out through a single door, one at a time, while a manager inspected their bags. It was a Saturday. Quitting time was 4:45. By 4:30, the women on the 9th floor were already thinking about the weekend. At 4:40, someone smelled smoke. A scrap bin on the 8th floor had caught fire, probably a dropped cigarette. Within minutes, the 8th floor was evacuated. The owners on the 10th floor were warned. Someone called down to the 9th floor. The line was busy. By the time the women on the 9th floor realized what was happening, the stairwell door was already hot to the touch. They ran to the Washington Place exit. It was locked. They tried the fire escape. It buckled under the weight and tore away from the wall, sending workers onto the pavement below. The fire department arrived. Their tallest ladders reached the 6th floor. In 18 minutes, 146 people were dead. The owners stood trial. Their lawyer argued that no one could prove Harris or Blank had personally locked the doors that day. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Not guilty. The civil lawsuit settled at $75 per victim. The owners collected $445 per victim from their insurance policy. They turned a profit. A woman named Frances Perkins watched workers fall from a building across the street that afternoon. She spent the next 30 years as Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, writing the fire codes, the safety laws, the workers' compensation rules that govern American workplaces to this day. She called March 25th, the day the New Deal was born. The Ash Building still stands. Every year on March 25th, volunteers gather at the plaque on the wall and read all 146 names aloud. It takes about an hour. summer of 1930 was the worst summer America had seen in a generation. Banks were failing. Farms were drying up. And if you were a black man in the Jim Crow South, your options were narrower than most. So when labor agents came through towns across Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, promising steady work and $4 a day at a tunnel job in West Virginia, men packed their bags and said goodbye to their families and rode north. Thousands of them. The project was massive. The New River Power Company, a subsidiary of Union Carbide, one of the largest chemical corporations in America, was drilling a tunnel straight through Gauley Mountain in West Virginia. 3,000 men showed up. About 75% of them were black, and the men assigned to work deepest inside the mountain, closest to the rock face where the air was thickest, were almost entirely black. That was not an accident. There was a lot of dust in the tunnel, white dust, fine as powder. It settled in their hair and coated their skin, and they could taste it in the back of their throats at the end of every shift. What nobody told them was that the rock they were drilling through was almost pure silica, silicon dioxide, the substance in glass, in sand. When you breathe it deep enough, long enough, it scars your lungs from the inside out. No water sprays, no masks, no warnings, just lungs and the white dust hanging in the air. About 6 months in, men started dying, not over years, over weeks. Men who had arrived healthy were dead before the season turned. The company managed it quietly. Black workers who died were not buried at the local cemetery in town. They were taken to an unmarked field on the company property outside of town. No headstones, no names. In 1933, the contractor settled 167 lawsuits. Total payout, $130,000. That is $780 per life. No criminal charges. Ever. Here is what the company's own documents showed. Before drilling began, their geological surveys confirmed the rock was 99% pure silica, and they had ordered the drills to run without water, because wet silica is commercially inferior to dry. The dust destroying those men's lungs was the product they were mining. Those men never came home. The tunnel is still in operation today. No one went to prison. No one ever will. America in the 1930s was building itself back up. The Depression had gutted the country, and what people wanted now was progress. Modern buildings, modern factories, modern homes that wouldn't burn to the ground. Steel mills roared back to life. Construction crews swarmed half-finished skyscrapers, and running through almost every one of those projects was a single material that promised to make it all safer, a soft, fireproof mineral mined straight out of the earth. The men who worked the mills that processed it called it the magic mineral. It came out of the ground as fine white fibers, light as cotton. Fireproof, indestructible, and cheap enough to insulate every pipe, every roof, every brake pad in the country. By the 1930s, the company running those mills was turning out more than 1,000 different products from it in a town in New Jersey, built almost entirely around the work. The dust settled so thick on the workbenches that men joked they could write their names in it. Nobody wore a mask. Why would they? The company said the fiber was safe enough to ride home on a man's clothes, into his house, onto his children. In 1933, doctors examining the workforce at one plant found nearly 1 in 3 men already had scarring on their lungs. The company didn't tell them. Instead, it quietly settled with 11 sick workers, on the condition their lawyer never bring a case against the company again. 2 years later, in private letters, company leadership put it in plain words. The less said about asbestos, the better off we are. They funded a medical study at a respected research lab, and when the results came back showing the dust caused tumors, the sponsors ordered every mention of cancer stripped out before publication. By 1949, the company's own doctor was advising executives not to tell sick workers what their x-rays showed. "Let the man work in peace," he wrote. The company benefits from his years of experience. Wives who shook the dust from their husbands' overalls before washing them got the same disease, without ever once setting foot inside a mill. The damage took decades to surface. By the time it did, for many, it had become a cancer almost nobody survives. Lawsuits finally caught up in the 1970s, once the buried paperwork started surfacing in court. In 1982, the company became the largest corporation in U.S. history to file bankruptcy. Not because it was broke. It used the filing to cap what it owed every person it had poisoned. That bankruptcy trust became the blueprint. In 2018, journalists exposed internal documents proving Johnson & Johnson had known since the late 1950s that its talc, a baby powder dusted onto infants in nurseries worldwide, sometimes tested positive for that same mineral. The company denied it, kept selling the powder, and didn't pull it from US shelves until 2020. Then it tried the identical bankruptcy maneuver Johns-Manville had invented decades earlier to make its own asbestos problem disappear. And it still hasn't worked.